on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the National History Center. Our guest today, hardly a guest since he is a fellow here at the center, is Don Doyle. He is a public policy fellow and a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. He teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses in United States history with a focus on the 19th century, the American South, and nationalism in the Americas and Europe. Before the University of South Carolina, he taught at Vanderbilt, the University of Michigan, and the University of Leeds. His publications include The Social Order of a Frontier Community, Nashville in the New South, Nashville Since the 1920s, New Men, New Cities, The New South, The South as an American Problem, Faulkner's County, America, Italy, and the Southern Question, and Nationalism in the New World. He is presently working on a book, the working title of which is The Cause of All Nations, America's International Civil War. This, I guess, is a very timely topic. Puts you right up there with Robert Redford in the movie and the Civil War and its consequences. Don Doyle on America's International Civil War.
Thank you very much, Roger, for the nice introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. And thanks also to Christian and as well as Roger for inviting me here. This has been the absolutely perfect place to begin a book on the American Civil War in Washington, D.C. at the 150th anniversary. As we're going through it, the newspapers, the Post, and the New York Times and others are just alive with discussion of this event and what it means. Never mind all the archives here that I've been working in the Library of Congress and the National Archives. Absolutely perfect. The story that I'm going to tell begins on a tiny Mediterranean island in September 1861. Henry Shelton Sanford was walking across this desolate island. He's U.S. minister to Belgium officially, but also head of what they called Secret Service for the Union in all of Europe. And he's there on an urgent secret mission for the Lincoln administration. And what I'm going to tell here is a story that absolutely riveted the attention of all the world for several weeks in the summer of 1861, and now is almost completely forgotten. Some of you may know what I'm talking about already. Sanford had left Brussels several days earlier, coming by train to Turin, then to the port of Genoa, where he secretly chartered a small private steamship and then sailed into the night, arriving on the island of Sardinia the next day, then taking a small boat over to this island called Caprera, and then walking amid the boulders and the goats of this desolate, windswept Mediterranean island. He was a career diplomat. He was the first to arrive for the Union in Europe. He was considered by William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, to be our ambassador in Europe. Very officious man. He always wore a black three-piece suit. He shunned the regal diplomatic plumage of European courts and instead insisted on wearing this black Republican coat. They called him the Black Crow. As he made his way across this island, he was approaching a meeting with the most famous man, or at least one of the most famous men in the world, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Here is the island of Caprera to give you an idea of how isolated this is. And Garibaldi, known as the hero of two worlds, for months the press in Europe and the Americas had been alive with rumors that Garibaldi, the champion of Italian unification, was coming with some or all of his army of red shirts to lead the struggle for America's reunification. And now Sanford arrived at Garibaldi's island home with an offer from President Lincoln to give him position, a command as Major General in the Union Army. Earlier that summer, the first unofficial contact was made with the U.S. government to Garibaldi in a letter that came from an obscure U.S. consulate in Antwerp by the name of James W. Quiggle, who was on his way out. He was a Buchanan appointee, and he was seizing what might have been a moment of glory. Quiggle wrote to Garibaldi, "The papers report that you are going to the United States to join the Army of the North in the conflict of my country. If you do, the name of Lafayette will not surpass yours. There are thousands of Italians and Hungarians who will rush to join your ranks, and there are thousands and tens of thousands of Americans who will glory to be under the command of the Washington of Italy." Quiggle even volunteered to join ranks himself. Now, Garibaldi had become a global hero going back to the 1830s when he was in South America, fighting in southern Brazil and in Uruguay. And then, of course, in his famous defense of the Republic of Rome in 1849, from which he escaped and finally made his way to exile in New York, where he spent more than a year on Staten Island in complete isolation. In the spring of 1860, the world watched with astonishment as Garibaldi led the Thousand, I Mille, in an invasion of southern Italy, landing in Marsala, sweeping across all of Sicily and on to Naples with this army of red shirts, joined by a growing army of thousands of peasants, some of them carrying no more than pitchforks and sticks. Precisely as the United States was coming apart, the newly united Kingdom of Italy was created in March 17th, 1861. They're now having a big controversy over there about their reunification, just as we are on our disunification. Garibaldi had made Italy. Perhaps this remarkable man might inspire an American risorgimento. Though he was reviled by the Pope and feared by the crowned heads of Europe, Garibaldi enjoyed enormous popularity, especially among liberals and the common people of Europe and the Americas. Women absolutely adored Garibaldi. They were wearing dresses fashioned after Garibaldi, red felt with big plumes, big sleeves that looked like the Garibaldi red shirts. There were images of him everywhere, like this one, or with his Hungarian pillbox hat, or in a poncho with his gray beard and those mesmerizing eyes staring out at people. Everyone knew what he looked like and who he was. Quiggle had forwarded all of his correspondence with Garibaldi on July 5th, and it should have arrived in Washington sometime around the First Battle of Bull Run, which occurred on July 21st. It was a day of humiliating defeat and a disorderly, some said cowardly, retreat by the Union forces just outside of Washington. The idea of bringing an aging Italian general who spoke no English and was crippled by arthritis probably would have been seen as a harebrained scheme a few days earlier, but now it looked like genius. And Seward saw in Garibaldi a charismatic world leader whose very presence, whose very sympathy with the Union would be a tremendous propaganda coup for the Union. Seward was also terrified that Britain, after the Battle of Bull Run, was going to recognize the South, and he wanted to do all he could to mobilize public opinion in Europe and around the world against it. Seward consulted with President Lincoln, and on July 27th, he sent instructions to Sanford to go immediately to, quote, the distinguished soldier of freedom and enlist his services in the present contest for the unity and liberty of the American people. Tell him that the fall of the American Union would be a disastrous blow to the cause of human freedom equally here in Europe and throughout the world. So here's this universalizing language that I'm going to be, that you'll hear more of later. And now Sanford and Garibaldi sat face to face in Garibaldi's rustic home in Caprera, discussing the terms of the offer and the purpose of the war. Garibaldi had two conditions. One was he wanted total command of all armed forces. And the other one was that he wanted the power to declare this a war against slavery. Like the captain of a ship, Garibaldi said, I would be of no use as second in command. I must be in charge. Still, Garibaldi was willing to fight for America, but what he wanted to know was what he would be fighting for. Tell me, he asked Quiggle in this earlier correspondence, tell me if this agitation is regarding the emancipation of the Negroes or not. Could slavery not be abolished, he pressed Sanford in this meeting. And all that Sanford could offer was the same that the Union party line was, a kind of a lesson in constitutional law and states' rights, about the limitations of the federal government in abolishing slavery. And Garibaldi, I think, like much of the world, found this explanation rather puzzling. If this was not, as he put it, a struggle for the salvation of Republican institutions, for universal emancipation, the war would appear like any civil war in which the world at large would have little interest or sympathy. As Sanford stayed at Garibaldi's house that night, they got up in the next morning, they talked for hours longer about Garibaldi possibly coming over and visiting. Finally, that fell apart, and Sanford began his long return from Caprera back to Brussels. For weeks, the story continued to play in the press, much to the embarrassment of the Union, who looked like they were desperate. They were calling in a foreign general. Garibaldi even revived the story a year later, frustrated by the refusal of the king to march on Rome. He asked if the invitation was still open, and there was another flurry and invitation and negotiations. Eventually, the Garibaldi story faded from the news and from historical memory, reappearing from time to time as a kind of bizarre curiosity in the story of a war that has been told almost exclusively as a self-contained American military contest fought on American soil by American soldiers over issues that had to do only with America and its future. But this was, I want to argue today, not just any civil war, as Garibaldi put it. People everywhere understood this to be a contest of enormous consequence to the world, and they followed events with close scrutiny and really knew who the players were, and they interpreted it as an event of great world importance. Conservatives and liberals throughout the Euro-American world came to interpret the war as an epic battle and a historic struggle that stretched back to the American and French revolutions. It was a contest that would decide the future of what people commonly referred to as the Republican experiment. Karl Marx and Lord Acton, Mazzini and Napoleon III, socialists, Republicans, liberals, monarchists, all of them began predicting that the outcome of the war would have enormous impact, for good or ill, on the way that nations were to be governed and the way people were to live. Today's disagreement over what we call this, the American Civil War, or the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression, as I hear in some parts down in the South, are really a kind of silly sounding echo of what was at the time a very serious matter of international law. At the beginning of the war, both sides repudiated the idea that it was a civil war. The North insisted this was a domestic insurrection. It was a rebellion. It was not a war. The Union refused to even refer to the rebellion as anything but the so-called Confederacy. For years, and until very recently, someone needs to study this, the Library of Congress always referred to the Confederate archives, which were purchased through this rather scoundrel of a man named Pickett, as the Pickett Papers. And I think it was a way of avoiding saying the Confederate archives or the Confederate. Now it is the Confederate States of America archives. Whenever I go up to order a box, I always say, I have box 12 of the so-called Confederate States of America archives. Lincoln's insistence that slavery in the states was safeguarded by the Constitution, laid out in his first inaugural address, most famously, was not, I will argue, a mark of moral insensitivity to the issue of slavery, nor was it an obsession with the border states that led him to this position. It was that, but more. Lincoln's guarantees of the safety of slavery were absolutely essential to his position that this was a rebellion without cause, an illegal, unjustified insurrection. The Union was trying to make this conflict off limits to international intervention. Whether aid to the rebels, recognition of the Confederacy, violation of the blockade, or the closing of the ports, not the blockade. All of this was a matter of international law. Confederates also insisted that this was not a civil war. This was not a legitimate struggle between two warring factions over control of the nation. This was, in their view, literally an international war from the beginning. They did everything to convince the world that they were already a legitimate nation and that their path to nationhood was legal and peaceful. Their strategy was to present themselves as a fait accompli by quickly assembling all the trappings of nationhood. The name, Confederate States of America, a constitution, a government, an army, uniform flags, money, stamps, a seal, a motto. Deo vindicus. I don't know how my Latin is. God will vindicate. God's vindication may have helped them, but they had to have international recognition or international vindication first. The wholesale appropriation of the U.S. Constitution not only simplified the process of nation building, it underscored the secessionist fundamental claim that this was not a revolutionary movement trying to overthrow the government or change its form. It was a peaceful withdrawal of what they like to call, what they insisted on calling, a compact, not a nation, a compact among states. Among its first order of business, this self-declared nation immediately sent forth envoys to the capitals of different foreign nations to gain recognition, to have their ministers received. And the first was, where else? Washington. And then London, Paris, Madrid, Mexico, Belgium, the Vatican eventually. The commissioners were instructed to explain that the southern states had lawfully withdrawn from a voluntary federation for just cause, that they had formed, quote, an independent government, perfect in all its branches, and endowed with every attribute of sovereignty and power necessary to entitle them to assume a place among the nations of the world. And they were further instructed to avoid all discussions of slavery, to emphasize instead the protective tariff and promise to those who would recognize them free trade. All of the debate over whether it's about slavery or the tariff and so on, it goes back to this original foreign policy strategy of the Confederates. Confederates wanted the different nations of the world to recognize the sovereignty of King Cotton first, then diplomatic recognition would follow. On May 13th, 1861, less than a month after Fort Sumter, the British government declared its neutrality, proclaimed that a state of war existed, and recognized both parties as belligerents. This is not the same thing as recognizing them as an independent sovereign state, but to recognize them as belligerents was a big blow to the Union. It elevated the rebels to legitimate parties in a war. It demoted the Union from a sovereign power that was policing a treasonous rebellion to one of two belligerents at war. But the real fear was that this was the first step toward full recognition of the Confederacy as an independent state. By former agreement, France would cooperate with Britain. At this time, they were cordial with one another, and it looked like the South was on its way to getting recognition. And with recognition, it meant that not just that their ministers would be received, but that they could make treaties, commercial treaties, guarantee loans, form military alliances. Crucially important, recognition would impose new, more stringent requirements on blockading the ports of the South, and it would smooth the path to mediation by outside parties. Recognition, in short, meant Confederate nationhood. It meant their victory. Now, separatist movements don't always need to win militarily to succeed. They need only not to lose, to hold on, to wait for foreign intervention or a negotiated peace. If in the meantime they suffer invasion and atrocities and a ravaged countryside, so much the better to make their case to the world of nations that we are victims of tyranny and oppression from our former rulers. And the South was confident, much too confident, it turns out in retrospect, that they could win international recognition whether or not they won the war. And to the very end, Jefferson Davis and others in Richmond hoped and even expected Britain or France would come to their rescue. They would never have risked secession and war if they had thought that they could not win international recognition, and it was one of their gravest miscalculations. Now, the Union's foreign policy goals were equally clear from the beginning, if only because they were defined solely in opposition to those of the Confederacy. What they had to do was to block recognition by any means necessary. Lincoln admitted to Seward, "I have no knowledge of the world or of diplomacy." He said, "I am apt to make blunders." And he handed over to William Seward vast powers to devise and to execute foreign policy. Let's see, we've got here Seward. Seward from New York, he was a seasoned veteran of New York politics and of Washington. He would have been a contender for the Republican nomination. Part of his preparation for office, so confident was he that he was going to get it, was that in 1859 he took himself out of the fray, went over to Europe, spent 8 months meeting all the heads of state, being introduced to all the political leaders. He came back much confirmed in his deep suspicion of Britain in particular and the great powers of Europe generally, and their jealousy toward America and their cynical pursuit of their self-interest at the expense of America. And he was convinced that they would recognize the South. If they wanted cotton, that they would do what they had to do to get it. I think Seward believed in King Cotton almost more than the Confederacy did. Britain and France would follow their material interests. They would bow to King Cotton and make alliance with an independent South. And he also understood the ideological role of the thrill that conservatives would have seeing democracy fail in America. The only thing that would stop them, Seward was convinced, was the fear of war with America. On the 4th of July, 1861, he invited over to his office here next to the White House in the State Department William Howard Russell, famed war correspondent from the Crimean War. He wrote for the Times of London, probably the most powerful newspaper in the world, certainly one of the most, or at least in Europe, and one of the most powerful in London, a conservative newspaper. Russell watched in stunned silence as Seward struck a match, let it burn, lit a cigar, filled the room with smoke, surrounding his head with this big thatch of hair and beak-like nose. People often compared him to a bird of prey, puffing on this smoke to great effect as the smoke swirled around the room. And he read this instruction, this message that he was about to send to Charles Francis Adams, the U.S. minister in London, essentially threatening war with Britain or any great power of Europe if they did anything to interfere with this domestic rebellion. If any European power provokes a war, we shall not shrink from it, he told, he read to William Howard Russell. And then he told him, he said, a contest between Great Britain and the United States would wrap the world in fire. More smoke. It would not be the United States lamenting the results, he added. Russell is stunned. He said, this is a man who's, you can hear the guns of the enemies from the White House or from the State Department here, and he's threatening war against a country the most powerful in the world that had invaded and occupied Washington in, was it 1813 or 14? 13, I think. Lord Lyons, the British minister in Washington, thought that Seward was going around the bend, that he was drinking too much, that he was losing his grip just under the strain. And they knew also about a memo that Seward had sent on April 1st to Lincoln, suggesting that he kind of take over the government as a prime minister, and that one of the first orders of business would be to launch a foreign war against either Spain or France or both, and that he believed a foreign war would drown the separatist sentiment in patriotic union. The hills of South Carolina would empty when the ships appeared in New York Harbor, absolutely, totally underestimating secessionist, separatist sentiment in the South. A lot of people historians ever since, and the British in particular at the time regarded Seward as kind of a loose cannon, a little bit crazy, a little bit off, and Lincoln in turn looks to us in retrospect and at the time as a very sober, a moderate, judicious man. I think Seward was crazy like a fox. The situation was really desperate, and he felt certain that Britain was about to recognize the Confederacy and end the whole game. But Seward also was not just imagining the menace that European designs imposed to America. Consider in the rest of 1861, for example, in May 1861, right after Fort Sumter, a Spanish fleet enters Santo Domingo and takes back a colony, the Dominican Republic, as part of the Spanish Empire. They'd been embroiled in their own civil war. In November 1861, when the Union apprehended two Confederate envoys on their way to London, James Mason and John Slidell, on the British ship Trent, it brought the two countries nearly to war, and it looked like Britain was really eager for a war. Seward almost got his wish. The British sent 10,000 troops to Canada and sent orders to begin reinforcing their navy in the British West Indies. In December 1861, a Spanish fleet of 26 ships and 6,000 troops landed in Veracruz, Mexico, the next month joined by British and French fleets, with soldiers totaling some 10,000. They were there supposedly to claim debts that were owed foreigners, but everyone knew that they were there to topple the regime of Benito Juarez, the Republican president who had been elected, and possibly to take over Mexico. With the United States caught up in war, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was a dead letter, and the Old World powers were moving quickly to reclaim lost New World empires. Now, in the lead was Napoleon III, nephew and heir of Napoleon I, who was called to lead the Second Republic in 1848, primarily because of his famous name. Like his uncle before him, Napoleon Le Petit, as Victor Hugo derisively called him, engineered a coup d'etat and had himself crowned emperor in 1851, promising a return to former glory for the French Empire. The invasion of Veracruz, Mexico was just the first step in what Napoleon III unveiled as his grand design for the Americas. Spain and Britain eventually abandoned this tripartite alliance before French troops that now totaled 30,000 marched on Mexico City. And they met stiff resistance from, here's Napoleon, Benito Juarez. They met stiff resistance from the Mexicans, but eventually forced Benito Juarez into exile in northern Mexico, pleading for help from the United States, which was offering to pay the interest for the loans. But again, that's not what the French wanted. With backing from large landowners and the Catholic Church, Napoleon III arranged for Maximilian, on loan from the Habsburgs of Austria, to be installed as the Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian I, with his wife Charlotte, known affectionately, or not so affectionately, I guess, as Carlota in Mexico. She was the younger daughter of Belgium's King Leopold, so this was a kind of a grand and far-spreading European monarchist design, not just the French. But Napoleon's grand design went far beyond taking over Mexico. As Michel Chevalier explained it, the goal was to, quote, save from irreparable ruin not only Mexico, but also the whole American branch of Latin civilization, which would be regenerated through the guiding influence of French intelligence, elevated sentiments, and military power. Maximilian's brother back in Austria was to, according to the grand design, was going to marry into the family of Pedro II, whose daughter was single, and that there would be an alliance now between the Portuguese as well as the Spanish American countries there, creating a vast Latin Catholic empire that would span the Americas in Europe and rival Teutonic Anglo-Saxon power in both hemispheres. Now, essential to Napoleon's design in Mexico was an alliance with the South's Confederacy. which would serve as a buffer state between Mexico and the U.S., containing the territorial expansion of the U.S., as well as the infection of democratic ideas. By controlling the Mississippi River, the Confederacy also might break off the Midwest from the northeastern states, further fragmenting and containing the United States. And Napoleon's plan was that Mexico would now reclaim California and all of the territory that had been given up in the concessions of 1848, even Texas by some designs. Napoleon said that he planned to slay the Republican dragon once and for all. During the Union blockade also, Mexico would play an important role as a conduit for a trade to come in through Matamoros and then take an overland through Texas. So the grand design was very important here in the geopolitics of the American Civil War. Much was made in promoting this plan of the affinity between Mexico's new conservative government and the Confederacy, their shared antipathy toward the disorder of democracy, the similarities between slavery and peonage, the importance of white supremacy in multiracial societies. And the Confederacy, for its part, through its emissary in Paris, John Slidell, made it very clear that the South did not subscribe to the Monroe Doctrine. It had no objection to a European monarch or a monarch of any kind as its neighbor. Confederates desperately needed French support, and the road to France went through Mexico. Now, Americans today, and I think for a long time, tend to see democracy as a rising tide, a kind of irresistible historical force that sooner or later arouses people to throw off the yoke of tyranny and dynastic rule. In the mid-19th century, however, it seemed that the whole experiment in popular sovereignty was failing everywhere. At the end of what historians still call the Age of Revolution that spanned the French Revolution to 1848, there were more republics in Africa than there were in Europe. Only Switzerland, a federal republic modeled after the United States in 1848, according to its constitution, and little San Marino, the tiny mountain republic inside Italy, upheld the republican experiment in Europe. There may be others that I don't know about, other little San Marinos. If there are, tell me. The American republics offered models of what modern nations based on popular sovereignty might look like, and that had once inspired the world, but by the 1860s, most served as alarming examples of the failed experiment in democracy. Most of the Spanish-American republics had at one time or another fallen into the hands of despotic military caudillos, or they were embroiled in civil wars. Ours was certainly not the only civil war in the Western Hemisphere that pitted the conservative forces of the church and wealthy landowners against Republicans. Mexico had witnessed just constant turmoil in its government before Benito Juarez and now continuing. Juarez, a full-blooded Zapotec Indian, led the liberal Republican Party to victory, only to begin this long war, La Reforma, through which they finally succeeded and triumphed, and now the conservatives turned to Europe, to France, to intervene. But the most spectacular failure of popular sovereignty in the Americas wasn't in Mexico. It was the United States, the great republic that now fell into this fratricidal civil war. This had been the foremost example of how a free people might govern itself, and now it became the foremost example of failure. When Lincoln referred to America as the last best hope of earth, it was not a boast. This was in December 1862, and it was instead a grim analysis of the dire circumstances of the Republican experiment. Conservatives delighted in witnessing the failure of the Great Republic, especially those in Britain. Sir John Ramsden, a Tory MP, told his fellow MPs that what they were now witnessing was, quote, the bursting of the Great Republican bubble. Great Republic, of course, now used as kind of rubbing it in. The great Republican bubble, which had been so often held up to us as the model on which to recast our own English Constitution. He's taking a shot at the radicals, John Bright and others, advocating an expansion of the suffrage. Ramsden went on to point out that, quote, the great distinction between the safe and rational and tempered liberties of England and the wild and unreflecting excesses of mob rule, which had too often desecrated freedom and outraged humanity in America. Conservatives constantly linked the mobocracy of the North to the hordes of immigrants, as they called them, the dregs of European society, who had transported their revolutionary inclinations from Europe after 1848, now to America. Every friend of despotism rejoices at your misfortune, William Howard Russell told his friend John Bigelow, a New Yorker. I fear, my friend, you are going to a mortal smash. The world will only see in it all the failure of Republican institutions. The failure of Republican institutions in time of pressure is demonstrated by all history. That history which America vainly thought she was going to set right and reestablish on new grounds and principles. Several began predicting that all of the American republics, including the United States, would eventually, by the end of the century, gravitate back to some kind of monarchy. Maybe constitutional monarchy, but they would be restoring some kind of monarchy. The affinities of the South's upper classes for the European aristocracy were staples of propaganda campaigns that were launched overseas, as was the South's antipathy toward the mobocracy, the fanatical egalitarianism of the North, especially with regard to immigrants, to blacks, to women. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, repudiated the egalitarian principles of the Declaration of Independence in his famous Cornerstone speech, which was widely publicized by Union agents throughout Europe. And we usually reference this with regard to blacks and to race, but also was a general condemnation of egalitarianism. But less well known is that some other Southern secessionists were willing to go much further in repudiating not just that aspect of the Declaration of Independence, but independence itself and republicanism. In the summer of 1860, this is before the secession crisis, Lord Archibald, British consul in New York, received a letter. It was unsigned, but it was attributed to Judah P. Benjamin, future Secretary of State for the Confederate States of America, and at that time a member of Congress from Louisiana. And the letter said that should Lincoln be elected, we will secede from the Union and form a separate government, or upon certain conditions at once return to our allegiance to Great Britain, our mother country. Many, very many of the most wealthy and influential planters throughout the South, this is still Benjamin, or purported to be Benjamin, have already discussed this alternative, and the popularity of the proposition seems to pass from one to another almost with elastic rapidity. Though these intentions had to be kept from the public, from the, as he put it, the gossiping newsmongers and babbling pothouse politicians, the letter went on that at private select dinner parties every day throughout the whole South, and not one of them ends without a strong accession to our forces. I've even heard some of them address each other by their titles already. Benjamin, who you remember fled the Confederacy and went over to England, became Queen's Counsel after the war, denied authorship. He was actually a British citizen. Remember, he was born in St. Croix. His parents had lived in London. But this was not the only evidence. There was quite a bit of talk about reunion, not with the North, but with the British or with some other European power. William Howard Russell, again, the reporter for the Times, said that he reported several expressions of what he called regret for the rebellion of 1776, not 1861, and a desire that, quote, England would receive back her erring children or give them a prince under whom they could secure a monarchical form of government. Louisiana rebels expressed an interest in coming back with the French. There is no doubt about the earnestness of their expressions on this, William Howard Russell said. Now, not all of these schemes by Napoleon or by the monarchists in the South need to be true or even plausible for us to understand that people everywhere at the time viewed the experiment in self-government to be imperiled, and that those defending liberal institutions felt embattled. And this was the prism through which observers began to interpret the American Civil War as an epic battle in the struggle, an ongoing historic struggle between democracy and aristocracy. Abraham Lincoln was not a man of worldly experience, but from the beginning of his career, his speeches give evidence of a fundamental understanding of America as an important part of a larger historical international experiment in self-government. He was accustomed also to viewing the world as one of contending forces between liberty and slavery, democracy and despotism, and also to seeing the enemies of liberty operating in very deep conspiracies out of the way, out of the press. America, he had warned in 1858, cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other. Now, he was talking about North and South and slavery and free states. But his view of society, divided over fundamental principles and locked in battle over its future course, prepared him to situate the American contest within a broader international and historic contest. Now, we're accustomed to thinking of Lincoln kind of wrestling with his ideas alone, pacing the floor of the White House or in his summer cottage north of the city, and kind of brooding over the plight of the Union, coming to terms with emancipation. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book, The Team of Rivals, tried to enlarge the sphere of influence by showing this very contentious cabinet and their influences upon him. And I think Seward in particular was a very important influence, someone who had an understanding or misunderstanding perhaps, but he did not shrink from assuming some knowledge of the world, let me put it that way, as Lincoln had earlier. But I found also that Seward short-circuited information and interpretations of the world coming into his office, to the White House. And an example of this comes with Carl Schurz, who was appointed as U.S. diplomat to Madrid, spent a great deal of time traveling about in Europe and gleaning public opinion from Europeans. Now, Schurz was a German 48er. He'd come over after the Revolution. He was one of the leaders of the left wing of the Republican Party. He was an abolitionist. He kept writing back to Seward, pleading with him to make this a war of emancipation. He got no satisfactory answer. And he finally decided to go over Seward's head. He was tired of the diplomatic business, wanted to come back and join the war, didn't like dressing up and all this regalia and going to court in this very conservative nation of Spain. And he arranged a private meeting with Lincoln at the White House in January of 1863. 63. Seward burst in on them when they just begun their meeting, and both men were startled, and for good reason. Lincoln asked him to go out, Seward to go out, and they continued their conversation. And after Schurz gave him this impassioned plea for emancipation, Lincoln calmly responded, "You may be right. You probably are. I have been thinking to myself, I cannot imagine that any European power would dare to recognize and aid the Southern Confederacy if it became clear that Confederacy stands for slavery and the Union for freedom." There's Lincoln, kind of cutting to the quick, cutting to the essence of the matter. Now, Schurz thought that he was telling Lincoln something new, but what I found is there's a large number of U.S. Diplomats and agents overseas all writing back to Washington and all thinking that they are telling Lincoln or Seward, telling Washington something new. It's unorchestrated. I thought there might be collusion among them because they use almost very similar language. But it's unorchestrated as far as I can tell, but very harmonious. The foreign public, they were telling Washington, is for the Union to the extent that they believe this to be a war against slavery, but not only against slavery, but for the preservation of democracy. George Perkins Marsh from Italy, just after the Garibaldi affair, when he's reflecting on what the European public is making of this. Europeans see this as, quote, a contest between the propagandists of domestic slavery and the advocates of emancipation and universal freedom. And he went on to say that if the Union does anything to condone slavery, to make a deal, to allow it to persist, anything to condone slavery, I have no doubt that the dissolution of the Union would be both desired and promoted by the vast majority of those who now hope for its perpetuation. John Bigelow pleaded from Paris. He was U.S. consulate to Paris, but also head of propaganda operations there, and a very important figure in this story that I am telling. He pressed Washington to arm the slaves, to bring them into the Union Army, to offer him freedom, to offer the black soldier his freedom, uniform, gun, a soldier's wages to every Negro who would serve a given period in the Army. No European government dares to side with the cause of slavery. If we do right, if we do it fairly, we shall carry with us the people here, and they will carry the government. And then one of the best examples of this is from John Murray Forbes, who was in the Secret Service trying to block Confederate shipbuilding in Britain and France. And a very wealthy railroad magnate from the Northeast who was a passionate abolitionist too. Our friends abroad see it, he wrote to Lincoln directly. John Bright and his glorious band of English Republicans see that we are fighting for democracy, for liberal institutions. The Democrats and the liberals of the old world are as much and as heartily with us as any supporters we have on the other side of the Atlantic. Our enemies, too, see it in the same light. The aristocrats and the despots of the old world see that the quarrel is that of the people against an aristocracy. So this wasn't this propaganda war overseas that I'm trying to get my arms around. It wasn't just a matter of Americans telling the world what they were fighting for. The world talked back, telling Americans what they understood to be at stake in the American question, as they called it. Not just for the United States, but for the entire world. In France, a coterie of intellectuals learned that they could thwart their censors and oppose Napoleon III and his imperialistic policies by advocating the Union as a kind of proxy for French liberalism, for French Republican ideals. The press was heavily censored, meetings were censored, and so on, but you could talk about America and talk about France. John Bigelow, whom we just met, a New York newspaper man, Republican Party organizer, arrived in Paris in September 1861 to take control of Union propaganda there. He found everyone that he encountered and all of the newspapers were aligned with the South and were committed to the idea that the Union was broken, that you could never force the South back into a Union once they had gone out. And then he discovered this historian, jurist, poet, Edouard René de Laboulaye, this Frenchman who had written a review essay of some other works on some publications on the American question, and he challenged the idea that the war was over or that the Union was broken. Bigelow went to meet him, and Laboulaye really admired America. He was one of those French who saw this long tradition and saw America as the example of the Republican ideal. He was a strong Republican. And he said that he would be happy to serve in any way a cause which is the cause of liberty and justice. He wrote an essay and challenged these assumptions. And Bigelow published it, sent it to all the ministers around Europe, all the diplomatic corps in France, to the press, to intellectuals in the French Institute. Friends of the Union multiplied, Bigelow glowed, multiplied, and those who have been discouraged and silent before were now emboldened to come forward and confess their sympathy and their hopes. Now, foreigners were interpreting, as Laboulaye, they were interpreting the American conflict in their own terms. a cacophonous debate over America's Civil War took place in speeches in Parliament, diplomatic dispatches, articles, by journalists, resolutions from abolitionists, public declarations from cotton mill workers, petitions from women's groups, clergy, propaganda that were aimed at immigrant recruits, pronouncements of presidents and emperors, and a multitude of other voices, some famous and some unknown, but a big debate going back and forth across the Atlantic. It wasn't all talk. Hundreds of thousands of foreign soldiers took up arms for the Union, some of them already in America, many of them getting on ships in Ireland and Germany and coming over. 1 in 4 of the Union Army was foreign-born. If we include the sons of immigrants, 42%, I estimate, were either immigrants or the sons of immigrants fighting for the Union. They never could have won without them. They were able to replenish their army from recruits overseas during a time when the Confederacy, limited now to its white population in decline and without any immigrants, was really straining. They brought banners and slogans, literally and figuratively, from the old world and from the struggles that they and their parents had fought in Europe. And they often conflated the war that they fought in America with the cause that they had fought in 48 or fought and lost in Europe. Recruitment posters in multiple languages called on soldiers to fight for liberty, America's liberty, the slaves, their own, it didn't matter. I'll turn to Lincoln and to about 10 more minutes, or yeah, to his the ways in which he began to integrate some of these foreign interpretations of the war, translations I call them. He offered a few brief remarks at Gettysburg at this cemetery, and you all know the story. He got up after this 2.5-hour long speech by Edward Everett and began 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Every school child knows the words. And in the narrative today, we know that it marks a kind of journey from a war that Lincoln thought was being fought for no higher purpose than to preserve the Union to a war for emancipation, to a new birth of freedom. And the last phrase is always interpreted to mean the Emancipation Proclamation. But I think we'll understand Lincoln better and the Union cause better if we see it as an allusion to this European understanding of universal emancipation, freedom to the free, as he put it earlier, and the upholding of the principles of democracy. The story of Lincoln's reluctant, pragmatic gravitation from the goal of preserving the Union to emancipating the slaves always elevates the latter cause to a higher moral plane. But I think we miss something fundamental if we fail to understand what made Lincoln and his audience think that the Union was worth preserving. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, he told his audience at Gettysburg, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And that simple phrase, any nation so conceived, immediately universalized the cause. This was a war in America, but not just about America. It was the defense of the Republican experiment of government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And we're all familiar with the story of how the audience, you can see it here in some of the few pictures, there's Lincoln up there in the crowd, weren't always paying attention. There was a lot of talk. They kind of missed it until they saw it in the press. But I would suggest that his audience wasn't just that crowd, that restless crowd in front of him. It was a larger world. And he alluded to it. He said, the world will little note nor longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And it was the earth, democracy for the earth, that the American war was being fought. Now, these words are quintessential Lincoln, but they were also part of an international vocabulary, of international republicanism. His most famous phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people, for example, was common coin of the realm. It had been used by Theodore Parker, by Daniel Webster, in different forms of, by, for, people, republic, nation. You can kind of put them together in various forms and see them. But it was most famously quoted by, or said by Giuseppe Mazzini earlier in the 1830s. Though he had virtually no formal education and very little exposure to the world beyond the Midwestern prairies, Lincoln proved to have an uncanny grasp of the issues surrounding the war and a remarkable gift for articulating what he understood to be at stake in the war. So Lincoln was learning, and learning not just alone by himself, but from these voices coming back, filtering through to him. News of Lincoln's assassination met with profound grief and enormous outpouring of enthusiasm from around the world. John Bigelow in Paris looked out the window of the legation. He's now the minister in Paris, replacing Dayton, who had died. And he saw thousands of young people gathering to support Lincoln, to express condolences. And the police came in and broke it up, trying to disperse them because they thought it would ignite a violent revolutionary movement for republicanism, I suppose. Bigelow counted 16 policemen outside the legation trying to keep the crowd at bay. I had no idea that Mr. Lincoln had such a hold on the heart of young gentlemen of France, he wrote to Seward. The night the news arrived in Paris, Laboulaye was lecturing on Benjamin Franklin, one of his favorite topics, to a large crowd at the Conservatory of Art. And he took the occasion, of course, to speak of Lincoln. His lecture was interrupted again and again by long applause from the crowd gathered there. Hundreds of letters poured in from all over the world, from Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, from heads of state, often in the usual formalities, but also from working men's groups, students, and Masonic lodges. Several of the accounts reported large memorial services, buildings draped in black, funeral processions with effigies of Lincoln. A remarkable feature of the letters was the common language, the phrasing, the sentiments, the historical allusions that run through them. And though they were written in dozens of languages and originating in vastly different social experiences, they were drawing nonetheless on an international vocabulary of liberalism that allowed them to speak in a common idiom about the people's struggle against the forces of despotism, martyrdom in the cause of liberty, sacrifice for the good of the nation. I've got several examples of these. They were published, all translated and published in a beautifully bound leather volume by the State Department and distributed to officials all around the world. But I'll share a few of them. The citizens of Acciareale, a little tiny fishing village in western Sicily, wrote this: "Abraham Lincoln was not yours only. He was also ours, because he was a brother whose great mind and fearless conscience guided a people to union and courageously uprooted slavery." And from Chieti, another Italian village in Abruzzo, that must have taken them 3 weeks to hear the news, but they met. And they wrote, "Your history is the same as ours. From Lincoln and Seward to Garibaldi and Mazzini, the tradition of the great struggle between good and evil, liberty and slavery, civilization and barbarism, national autonomy and the rule of foreign despots has ever been the same. Statues, plaques, and memorials to Lincoln were erected in towns and cities around the world. Streets and squares were named in his honor. Children, by the thousands it must have been, were named, including in his honor, including Garibaldi's grandson, by the way." Edouard Laboulaye in Paris organized a campaign to mint, this is some of the imagery of Lincoln's apotheosis. Punch, which had ridiculed Lincoln in numerous cartoons, now shows Britannia laying a wreath on the body with Columbia weeping. Okay, I'm just about to finish with this allusion. Let me just explain this medal. This was raised by Laboulaye in a subscription that was limited to 2 centimes each. So it involved thousands of Parisians and others in France, and was presented to Mrs. Lincoln with this inscription and the instructions to John Bigelow: "Tell Mrs. Lincoln that in this little box is the heart of France." In the inscription there, Laboulaye refers to Lincoln, who saved the Republic without veiling the Statue of Liberty. This is a reference to a statue that, of course, does not exist until 1886, but it's the beginning of the idea of the Statue of Liberty, which Laboulaye also began another subscription to in France, an international statue that we think of as welcoming immigrants in a symbol of all that, but it was really also a statue in commemoration of the Great Civil War. And it's an international statue of liberty enlightening the world, the official title, published in unveiled, finally unveiled in that sense in 1886. That will be it.
Thank you, Don. We have about 30 minutes for questions and discussions. Would people please identify themselves? Yes.
About the British and French policy, but you didn't say anything about Russian policy. And the reason I think of this is that the United States was a supporter of Russia in the Crimean War in the 1950s, and I understand that the Russians were well-wishers on the Union side in the Civil War, and certainly Britain and Russia were increasingly at odds in other parts of the world in the Central region. Did Russia do anything actively to support the Union side, or did the Union side seek?
They wanted support from any place they could get it, and there's the famous story of how during the revolution in Poland, which the United States accepted without protest, despite this effort to otherwise align themselves with the forces of republicanism, but the Russian government sent its fleet to New York and also to San Francisco, which some wanted to interpret as a show of solidarity and to discourage any intervention in Poland. Russia was not an active ally in any way, but it was regarded as a more truly neutral power. And of course, you know that Alexander II wasn't emancipated the serfs, and this was also interpreted, whether accurately or not, doesn't matter, does it? In propaganda, interpreted as a sign of the spreading force of liberalism.
Dorothy Ross.
Yes, I want to hear what Dorothy is going to ask me. We had an interesting conversation today on this.
Yeah, and this was a very interesting presentation. I was wondering about the timing during the war. If I heard you correctly, one of those European ministers was coming in to tell Lincoln in 1863.
Yeah,
you know what
Carl
was going
Schurz.
on, and the Emancipation Proclamation had already been issued January 1st. So
I had that date wrong, didn't I?
Oh, I don't.
Yes, it was 62. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I knew.
Well, I still I still have it, because I wonder how was the Emancipation Proclamation greeted as the fait accompli, that the slaves were emancipated, that the war was now for emancipation, because then it was a more gradual process. Yes. In the United States, obviously, and it wasn't even clear to many people at the end of the war that it would actually, until the 13th Amendment, that it was going to be made permanent.
Yes. That's a good question. My discussion of that was left on the cutting room floor in the interest of time, which I already was up against here. But the excuse for not-emancipating the slaves, apart from the constitutional arguments that were always trotted out, was that this would incite servile insurrection in the South, that it would further upset the cotton market, and that this was a way of explaining to Europeans why they didn't want to do that. and this was voiced principally by Seward as an explanation for why the Union was not backing emancipation. And as we probably all know, Seward was very reluctant to endorse the Emancipation Proclamation, tried to delay it, and so on, did delay it. But it took a while. In fact, it was widely interpreted, even among some in the liberal press, that now Lincoln and the Union were going to this kind of dastardly extreme in a war to invite servile insurrection. That was the term used. Public opinion turned, though, in January, first when it was actually enacted. And then there were public meetings, hundreds of them, all through Britain and the British Isles, and from different groups showing nobodies are the same ones who stopped your country, who banned the slave trade and who emancipated your own slaves, and they are rising now in support of the Union. So it took a while, but into January, and in Britain, and then by the spring, I think the Emancipation Proclamation really did have a huge impact on public opinion, which constrained but did not define and delimit entirely foreign policy. So there were still efforts after that, and after Gettysburg, to intervene through mediation. Now, of course, not to recognize the South and get the cotton, but now out of humanitarian concern for all the bloodshed that continued. And I'm mocking them a little bit, but I think that there was some insincerity there, especially on Napoleon III's part.
Arnita Jones. Could you identify yourself, Arnita?
Arnita Jones, emerita from the AHA, and more embarrassingly, maybe from the OAH as executive director, because a few decades ago I was actually a student of German history, not U.S. history. And my memory is you also didn't speak very much about Germany in this. And of course, there was no Germany, yes. But there was a Prussia, and my memory is that the Prussians sent over a number of not advisors, but observers,
yes.
Because they were interested in a war that was being fought differently and the impact
yes.
of railroads and industrialization and so forth. But did they have any position on the issues you've been talking about?
Bismarck maintained neutrality. He had his hands full with his own affairs. Exactly. There's some interesting exchange between him and an old college friend of his, John Lothrop Motley, a historian and U.S. minister to Vienna, and they corresponded about it. Bismarck asked at one point, "Do you all know what you're fighting for?" It's kind of an interesting exchange, but he was genuinely neutral. Now, many German, particularly German liberals, took great pride in the role that German Americans played in the war. About 40% of those German soldiers, of the foreign-born soldiers, were born in the German states, and they played a very important role also during the war in recruiting and coming over.
Mel Leffler.
Hi, Don. That was a great talk. I'm wondering if you could elaborate.
Yourself, please. Identify yourself, please.
Oh, Mel Leffler. I thought you identified me, Roger.
I know Mel.
Don, could you tell us a little bit more about Confederate agents and representatives, how they viewed the propaganda campaign of the Union, who they perceived as their constituency, and the extent to which they perceived the resonance of Union propaganda?
Good question. I actually began with a paper on I was calling it the Confederate Dilemma. I'm going tomorrow, in fact. I'm leaving for a conference in the Netherlands on the South and Europe, and I'm giving a paper on the Confederacy and the Confederate propaganda program. The South and Europe, yeah. It's a general conference, but my paper will be on just this topic. and I thought, well, the logical thing to do would be just to give the same lecture, right? But instead, I wrote 2 different ones because I really wanted to get into this Union side of the story, and it was an incentive to put at least some of my thoughts down. But this is a fascinating story of the Southern Confederacy. There was the South had sealed itself off from debate. They regarded challenges to slavery as just being either the result of fanatical zealots in the North, motivated by partisan motives entirely, insincere, or just ill-informed and ignorant. And so, and they also just couldn't believe when they got over to Europe that so many people really believed that slavery was wrong. Slavery had never been, emancipation had never been a prerequisite for international recognition. France still had slaves when it was recognized as the Second Republic. Brazil in the 1820s, the United States after its revolution still had slaves. After all, it had not been a factor before. It was now. I think that public opinion had changed enormously. Not the opinion of the government leaders, but public opinion. And my argument for this, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in this, I don't know whether she causes or just indicates the popularity now of anti-slavery. But what the Confederate agents abroad found was that, as William Yancey, the first to go to London, wrote back, he said, they have read Uncle Tom's Cabin and they believe it. It was widely published, bought, pirated, and published under different names, acted on stage. There was a very popular Italian opera, the Bianchi e Neri, and there were all kinds of trinkets and toys and dresses and wallpaper and everything. It was part of popular culture. And what Henry Hoates, one of the Confederate, the head of Confederate propaganda in Britain, said that in Britain, slavery was still debated. There were public demonstrations because there was still debate about that. In France, it was a settled matter. It was absolutely off the table. There was no debate about slavery. At least this was his complaint. Edwin de Leon, who was head of all propaganda operations for the Confederacy, went to France. He felt that this is where the Confederacy is going to win. Britain is a lost cause. And he published this pamphlet in French. Apparently it was French that was a little bit too Americanized for the French press, but it wasn't just the syntax or the grammar. It was the idea that people, the French press, even the conservative press who supported the Confederacy, they did not want to be part of a defense of slavery, and to recognize a country whose main purpose was to perpetuate slavery. I think this is a distinction too, as opposed to Brazil or others, the United States, that they weren't declaring independence in order and solely to perpetuate slavery. The Confederacy, in the eyes of most, was. But so they saw what they were up against. They thought that they could never sell slavery, and they began, both de Leon and Hoates came to the realization that we are not going to persuade them. This is beyond debate. Hoates wanted to enlist new advocates of scientific racism, Gobineau in France, the Anthropological Society in London, to argue, to jettison slavery and to argue for the South as a model of white supremacy. In an age of imperialism, they would look like a modern model of a society based on racial inequality, rather than defend slavery, which was now regarded as a barbaric relic of the past. De Leon came to similar conclusions, but he said, call back the diplomats, put all the money that you're spending on ink and propaganda and diplomacy into guns, and win the war on the ground. Don't try to persuade Europe. They'll come to us once we win the war. But they both were coming to the conclusion that slavery was not a debate. They couldn't win it.
Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for just a terrific talk. It was engaging and fascinating, and for me anyway, illuminating. I really want to build on Mel's question, that exactly what information was coming back to Jefferson Davis, and particularly after the letter from Robert E. Lee and others saying that you can't win the war without European support. You won't get European support if you stick with slavery. And I understand they did debate it in the Confederate Congress and still just couldn't take that step.
Yes, they actually were prepared to take the step, and at the final hour, they sent a special commission. They figured all of the other commissioners over there. They called them commissioners because they weren't really recognized ministers yet, just to FYI. But they sent this Duncan Kenner, a very large, an owner of thousands of slaves, over to France and to Britain to offer emancipation for recognition. And he arrives there in February. March is negotiating. But in 1865, curtains are closing. It was an untenable political situation. I mean, they did debate arming the slaves, and they did actually enact legislation, and I think they did even put some in uniform. But you know, there was a part of the Confederate Constitution was that the federal government of the Confederacy could not pass any law that would abolish slavery. So they were bound constitutionally, just like the Union said it was at the beginning of the war, by their own constitution. But apart from that, it was constitutionally untenable.
I'm Phil Katz. Two things. First, just tacking on to your mention of Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course it worked both ways, that she was closely following these liberal streams in Europe as well. There's an extremely interesting passage, not in Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in the sort of the technical apparatus that she published with it, the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where of course she talks about the Hungarian Revolution and talks about Lajos Kossuth, who is wildly popular in this country, and how it relates to the issues that she's talking about. And it's quick. It's sort of maybe 2.5 pages, but it captures these big currents that were around. So it's not just Harriet Beecher Stowe being eccentric, but capturing part of these international currents that you're talking about. The other interesting thing is we're talking about slavery, and sorry, this isn't a question but a commentary, is that there's also slavery as metaphor. There's slavery as the actual slavery, but of course there's also slavery as a shorthand way of talking about the laboring classes. And in some ways in Europe this was every bit as important, if not more so, to the discussion of how they thought about what the Union was doing. So certainly another person you easily could have added to your slides here, and maybe there's a longer version, is Karl Marx.
Yes.
And the International Working Men's Association in its early days, its early stage, applauds Lincoln and sends him letters and says, we recognize what you're doing with slavery is about the emancipation of all working people everywhere.
Yes.
And there were a number of Europeans in 1864 who didn't think Lincoln was going far enough, and many of the backers of the Fremont insurgency in 1864 are foreign-born radicals who feel this is great, we're fighting for sort of the world of liberty, but Lincoln hasn't gone far enough, so we're going to side with Fremont, who we sort of think of still as an honorary Frenchman anyway. And they're a fringe movement, but they're part of the spectrum that you're talking about, and sort of the left wing of that spectrum. So
yes. No,
it illuminates really important things you're talking about.
That's Karl Marx will actually be featured in the book as I call them foreign interpreters, and he was fascinated by the war. He and Engels had maps all over the dining room table and were studying all the papers, and he was getting. Yeah.
Yes.
Despite public opinion being against the Confederacy, how close did it come that the governments could have recognized it anyway? Like, if the battles of Antietam or Gettysburg had gone differently, might there have been recognition of the Confederacy by either Britain or France?
Yes, and I don't want people to take away that public opinion was aligned against the Confederacy, but this evolves over time. I think I was not able to give enough of the shift over time, but at first I think that the Confederacy actually had the upper hand, at least in the press, and certainly among the governments. I think the governments wanted the Confederacy to win, and they could have won it on the ground, as it were, if Antietam had gone differently. For example, this was interpreted, this is now in September of 1862, the Emancipation is waiting on the shelf, ready to be taken out. Lee and the Confederate forces are menacing Washington. If they had won that and advanced, the blow to the Union would have been difficult to recover from. And there was a great deal of interest in Britain and France and others in recognizing the Confederacy. So I think it was perilously close, and not just then, but it keeps coming back that it may not have been outright recognition, but mediation that would have, in effect, given the Confederacy legitimacy, and it would have been very hard to negotiate reunion, I think, with a third party.
Jim Grossman from the AHA. Two questions. One of them is short. Did the Europeans refer to the Union or to the United States? Which really matters, actually, because one does imply two equal sides and the other one implies a resurrection. The second one is, I'm struck that you're arguing that popular opinion in Europe that the problem was a country whose main purpose is the perpetuation of slavery, and yet for 100 years after the Civil War, the South somehow wins, and the Civil War does not become the defense of a country whose main purpose is the perpetuation of slavery in American culture. So I'm curious as to if that's such a powerful popular strain in Europe, does European, in essence, memory of the American Civil War go off just on a different trajectory from our own?
I think so, insofar as the Union victory makes it appear, in Lincoln's martyrdom, makes it appear among at least liberal opinion that this was, in fact, a war against slavery and a war to uphold Republican principles and so on. That I think is the dominant narrative. They use the term Union and America and the United States interchangeably. I will look for that more closely, but I've seen that, and you saw it like on the medal there. It was, preserved, restored the Union, saved the Republic, the Great Republic. All of these terms I think were used interchangeably, but the Union. I think what you were saying is that to call it the Union was to kind of identify its name as a belligerent against the Confederacy.
Union and Confederacy are equivalent terms. Mm-hmm. This is an argument that actually Jim Horton used to make very powerfully. Whereas the United States, if you call the North the United States, it implies much more strictly the notion of a rebellion against the army of the United States of America, in essence.
There were lots of digs about the once United States, the former Union, just as the United States called it the so-called Confederacy. That game could be played both ways.
Professor Gavin Young.
Gavin Wright from Stanford and the Wilson Center. This is so interesting. You're really saying the Civil War was a lot like the Cold War period, where conflicts all over the world, Americans would interpret them in terms of which side are they on in the Cold War, probably very differently from the way locals interpreted it. But the book that I know is J.E. Cairns' The Slave Power, The Economist, which I think was very influential, and it was a scathing portrayal of slavery as an economic system. Yes. But he says in the introduction, and I think the publication date is 1863. It's a foregone conclusion now that the war is going to end in a mediated settlement, and the only real issue is what the border is going to
Yes.
be. And this was a book that was very critical of the South.
Yes.
So I guess it supports the idea. It was not at all clear how it was going to go.
It was an ongoing battle to win that. It's the idea of what has happened, and a fact has been accepted that the Union is broken, and even liberals who would anti-slavery forces would concede this in resignation, and I think that so the Union had a steep hill to climb, not just in persuading them that this was a war against slavery or that they could win militarily, but that anyone could win to restore a union. The special problem being, of course, is that this is supposed to be a voluntary society, a democracy in which, you can't rule at the end of a gun muzzle. And, of course, that continued to play out during Reconstruction.
Don, how could the South of the Confederacy have played it better, have brought about more international recognition on their side?
I think that probably their best bet would be they began by kind of using the language, dressing, as it were, as a liberal nationalist fighting for self-determination, victims of northern tyranny. I think that the contradiction between that and slavery, once they realized that, is difficult to surmount. And there were contradictions on the Union side too. I think they probably should have developed an all-out reactionary, aristocratic, racist program, and that they probably would have been more successful with at least the governing classes. And I think that, as we know, that kind of racism would have its appeal later in the century. And I don't know that they would have they certainly would have alienated the masses, but France wasn't a democracy. I mean, they didn't have to answer to the public. It limited, but it didn't determine foreign policy. I'm being a little bit fanciful here, and I don't know that they had a chance to be successful. But trying at the 11th hour to distance themselves from slavery was not working, and it was unbelievable. And I think they probably should have done a lot more careful thinking about the actual chances for recognition before they jumped off that cliff of secession. And they were overconfident about, as Faulkner says, they thought they were flying. Instead, they were falling. The earth was rushing up.
Phil Katz again.
What they could have done is won some more battles.
Yeah.
And if the South had won, if the South had won at Antietam, I mean, Jim has always taught it as the Saratoga that never happened. And as a student of his, I buy his argument that the best thing the South could have done is win more battles.
Yes.
Because there's no argument they had that was appealing enough to any of the self-interest that would tip over any of the European powers.
A stunning victory at one battle, I think, would have helped. This was a war of attrition, and I think that what gave the Union victory was that ability to draw on a huge population, none of whom were enslaved. All of them were eligible, and overseas, too, to draw them over. I don't know how many tens of thousands came over from abroad to serve. They didn't ask. You want to fight? Here's a gun. There were very few records kept. Some of them after the war allow me to estimate how many were foreign-born or the children of foreign-born. But that ability, John Bigelow said that this is the secret of how we were able to replenish our army during 4 long years of war. It wasn't the draft, it was this overseas enlistment or enlistment of immigrants. And the South, in turn, couldn't do that. A third of their population was enslaved, and they debated it, but they couldn't go there. I don't know. They show up in other wars,
How do we know that they came home happy? Do we know if they came in the 60s?
No, we don't. There's a good deal of enlistment propaganda. Some of them are signing up with with bounty brokers who are paying their passage and then will collect bounty on the other end. There's a great deal of controversy because it's against the law. It's a violation of the British Foreign Recruitment Act that goes back to 1819, I think, that you can't come into a foreign country or into Britain and recruit foreign soldiers. So it has to be done undercover. But it was done. And of course, the Homestead Act was passed and widely publicized. You want to come to America? Wages are rising, free land, come over. The South.
Last question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Last question.
I just wanted to, you mentioned a couple of times that they didn't think secession through. And I'm wondering how precipitate a decision you thought that was, because you mentioned even Benjamin speaking of it in 1860, and I thought a number of Southern leaders had threatened it should Fremont have won in 1856. So how precipitate was that? Was secession not being cooked over some years before Lincoln's victory?
Oh, yeah. At least since 1850 with the Nashville Convention, the fire eaters talked about secession, but they were a tiny kind of fringe minority. But they shut off debate and they close off any opposition and reduce it to submissives who are refusing to stand up to the Union, and also promise the moderates, we're not actually going to concede, we're going to threaten it and then bargain and get some kind of guarantees about the perpetuation of slavery. So a lot of people went along with them not knowing. Well, the fire eaters dominate the debate by 1860, and there's a tremendous fear and a rush to secession with the idea that we can't wait and see. Once Lincoln gets power, then they'll control the federal forts, and they will be under the tyranny of this black Republican government. We must secede now. So there's a rush and a panic, if you will.
We hope everyone will continue the conversation over a glass of